Imagine for a second that it's 1979. You're a factory worker in Youngstown, Ohio. You clock in at 6 a.m. at the steel mill where your father worked, and his father before him. The pay is good, about $25 an hour in today's money. You've got health insurance, a pension waiting for you at 65, and you just bought a house in a neighborhood where everyone works at the same mill. Your kids go to good schools. The downtown is thriving. On Friday nights, Main Street is packed. Life isn't perfect, but it's stable. You're building something. A career. A family. A future. Now fast forward to 2010. That mill? Closed. Your job? Gone. Your pension? Cut in half. Your house? Worth less than you paid for it 30 years ago. Downtown? Boarded up. Half your neighbors have left. The other half are hanging on by a thread. And nobody, not the politicians, not the economists, not the talking heads on TV, seems to have a straight answer about what the hell happened. This is the story of how America lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs in just 2 decades. But more than that, it's the story of how an entire way of life collapsed, how communities were hollowed out, and how the economic foundation of the American middle class was systematically dismantled. The numbers are staggering. The human cost is incalculable. And the ripple effects are still shaping our politics, our economy, and our national identity today. Let's rewind to understand what we lost. In 1979, American manufacturing reached its peak. Nearly 20 million Americans worked in factories. That represented 22% of all jobs in the country. Manufacturing wasn't just an industry, it was the backbone of the American economy and the engine of the middle class. These weren't minimum wage jobs. Manufacturing workers in the 1970s earned significantly more than the average American worker. A high school graduate could walk into a factory and make enough to buy a house, support a family, and retire with dignity. The work was hard, sure. Long hours, physical labor, sometimes dangerous conditions. But it paid. And it came with benefits that sound almost mythical today: pensions, healthcare, job security. The industrial heartland stretched from upstate New York through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Milwaukee, these weren't just cities. They were manufacturing powerhouses. Detroit churned out cars. Pittsburgh forged steel. Cleveland made machine parts. These cities were among the largest and fastest growing in the nation. But manufacturing's dominance was built on a specific set of circumstances that were already beginning to erode. American factories faced virtually no foreign competition. Europe and Japan were still rebuilding from World War II. China was a closed economy. There was no internet, no global supply chains, no container ships the size of skyscrapers, making it cheaper to produce things on the other side of the world than in your own backyard. By the early 1980s, those circumstances were changing fast. Manufacturing employment didn't collapse overnight. It started slowly, then accelerated into a crisis. Between 1979 and 1989, the United States lost about 1.3 million manufacturing jobs, a 7% decline. That might not sound catastrophic, but it represented a fundamental shift. For the first time in modern American history, manufacturing employment was falling even during economic expansions. Several forces converged at once. First came foreign competition. Germany and Japan weren't just rebuilding, they were innovating. German engineering became synonymous with quality. Japanese manufacturing pioneered new production techniques like just-in-time inventory and total quality management. Suddenly, American manufacturers that had grown fat and complacent under decades of monopolistic dominance were facing competitors who made better products at lower costs. The 1973 and 1979 oil shocks hammered American automakers particularly hard. Gas prices tripled. Consumers who had been buying gas-guzzling American sedans suddenly wanted fuel-efficient Japanese imports. Companies like Toyota and Honda, which had been marginal players, became serious threats. By the early 1980s, Japanese cars were everywhere on American roads. Then came automation. Throughout the 1980s, factories began installing industrial robots, computer numerical control machines, and automated assembly lines. A single robot could replace multiple workers, running 24/7 without breaks, benefits, or bathroom stops. Labor productivity soared. Factories could produce more with fewer people. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. The Rust Belt's decline started well before globalization became the dominant narrative. Research shows the region's problems began in the 1950s when its dominant industries faced virtually no competitive pressure and had little incentive to innovate. Powerful monopolies set high prices. Strong unions negotiated generous wages. Neither side had much reason to improve efficiency or develop new technologies. When competition finally arrived from abroad and from the American South, where labor was cheaper and unions weaker, Rust Belt manufacturers were caught flat-footed. They hadn't invested in new technology. They hadn't streamlined operations. They were vulnerable. Manufacturing employment stabilized somewhat in the 1990s. There were even modest gains. But it was a false dawn. Then came 2000. And everything changed. In May 2000, Congress granted China permanent normal trade relations, paving the way for China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. This wasn't just another trade deal. It was the economic equivalent of opening a dam. American manufacturers had been outsourcing some production to Mexico after NAFTA in 1994. But China was different. China had a labor force of over 700 million people. Chinese factory workers earned a fraction of what American workers made, sometimes as little as 50 cents an hour compared to $15 to $25 an hour in the US. And the Chinese government was willing to subsidize industries, manipulate currency, and ignore environmental and labor standards to attract manufacturing investment. The result was the most dramatic manufacturing job loss in American history. Between 2000 and 2010, the United States lost 5.5 million manufacturing jobs. Read that again. 5.5 million jobs. In one decade. That's a 33% decline in manufacturing employment. It was a faster contraction than during the Great Depression. Economists David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson documented what they called the China shock in landmark research. They found that increased Chinese import competition led to manufacturing job losses concentrated in specific regions and industries. Communities that produced goods that competed directly with Chinese imports, textiles, furniture, electronics, apparel, were devastated. The impact was geographically concentrated. A factory closing in a small Midwestern town didn't just cost 500 jobs. It destroyed the tax base. It closed schools. It emptied downtown businesses. It triggered a cascade of economic devastation that spread through the entire community. Computer and electronics manufacturing was hit particularly hard, losing over 750,000 jobs between 2000 and 2024, a 43% decline. Apparel manufacturing lost over 450,000 jobs. Printing and related industries shed 452,000 jobs. Furniture manufacturing lost 60% of its workforce. But it wasn't just about China. Automation continued accelerating. Since 2000, roughly 1.7 million manufacturing jobs have been lost to robots and automation. Research by MIT economists Darren Acemoglu and Pasquale Restrepo found that between 1990 and 2007, each new industrial robot replaced about 1.6 manufacturing workers. Add one robot per 1,000 workers to a region, and employment drops by 0.39 percentage points while wages fall by 0.77%. The automation story is more nuanced than it first appears. Not all automation happened because labor was too expensive. Much of it happened because it was simply more efficient. Robots don't get tired. They don't make mistakes. They work around the clock. In industries where precision and consistency matter, machines often outperform humans. But here's what the statistics don't capture: the human cost. When a factory shuts down in a small town, it doesn't just eliminate jobs. It eliminates a way of life. Economic research shows job loss is one of the most traumatic experiences a person can endure, comparable to divorce or the death of a family member. Mortality rates spike among displaced workers. Depression and anxiety soar. Substance abuse increases. Family structures break down. Manufacturing workers who lost their jobs during the 2000s faced a brutal reality. There were no equivalent jobs to replace what they'd lost. Many took significant pay cuts, moving from manufacturing jobs paying $25 an hour with benefits to service sector jobs paying $13 an hour without benefits. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, 2 out of every 5 displaced manufacturing workers who found new employment in 2016 experienced a wage reduction. 1 out of 4 took a pay cut of more than 20%. For a worker earning the median manufacturing wage of about $39,500 per year, a 20% pay cut meant losing nearly $8,000 annually. That's the difference between making mortgage payments and foreclosure, between keeping the lights on and having them shut off. Many workers simply left the labor force entirely. The employment-to-population ratio in manufacturing-heavy regions plummeted. Prime-age men, workers between 25 and 54, traditionally the most reliably employed demographic, dropped out of the workforce at alarming rates. Some took early retirement. Some went on disability. Some just gave up. The social fabric of communities tore apart. Crime rates increased. Drug epidemics took hold, first methamphetamine, then the opioid crisis. The connection between manufacturing decline and opioid deaths is well documented. Communities that lost the most manufacturing jobs saw the sharpest increases in opioid overdoses. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, Flint, and Gary became symbols of American decline. Detroit's population fell from 1.85 million in 1950 to around 670,000 today, a catastrophic 64% decline. Youngstown lost over 60% of its population. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Buildings crumbled. Infrastructure decayed. Political scientists argue that the manufacturing decline fundamentally reshaped American politics. The economic dislocation and sense of abandonment in the Rust Belt helped fuel the populist movements that have dominated recent elections. When people feel the economic system has failed them, they become receptive to politicians promising to blow it all up. So what really happened? Was it trade or technology? Economists, politicians, and pundits have argued for decades about what really killed manufacturing jobs. Was it trade? Was it automation? Was it policy failures? The truth is complicated. The mainstream economic consensus for years was that automation, not trade, was the primary culprit. Economists pointed out that manufacturing output in the United States continued to grow even as employment fell. Factories were producing more with fewer workers. Productivity gains explained the job losses, or so the argument went. But recent research has challenged that narrative. Economist Susan Hausman at the Upjohn Institute found that much of the apparent productivity growth in manufacturing was a statistical illusion. When you strip out the computer and electronics sector, where rapid technological improvement made products much cheaper and created inflated output figures, the rest of manufacturing showed productivity growth only slightly above the private sector average. In other words, manufacturing wasn't becoming dramatically more efficient. It was shrinking. Trade, particularly the China shock, played a much larger role than initially acknowledged. Otter, Dorn, and Hansen's research suggested that Chinese import competition alone may have cost 2 to 2.4 million American jobs between 1999 and 2011. That's massive. But automation mattered too. While robots currently explain only a small portion of total job losses, because there simply aren't that many robots in factories yet, the trend is accelerating. By 2030, Oxford Economics projects that up to 20 million manufacturing jobs could be lost to automation globally. The reality is that trade and technology work together. Foreign competition pressured American manufacturers to become more efficient. The easiest way to become more efficient? Replace expensive American workers with either cheap foreign workers or robots. Often companies did both. NAFTA's role is more ambiguous than political rhetoric suggests. Research shows NAFTA probably cost some manufacturing jobs. Estimates range from 15,000 to several hundred thousand depending on methodology. But the impact was much smaller than the China shock. NAFTA became a political scapegoat for broader trends that had more to do with China, automation, and structural changes in the global economy. But not everyone was affected equally by manufacturing decline. Workers without college degrees took the hardest hit. Between 2000 and 2017, employment rates for men without a high school degree fell dramatically in manufacturing-heavy regions. A 10 percentage point decline in local manufacturing share reduced local employment rates by 3.7 percentage points for prime-age men and 2.7 percentage points for prime-age women. The manufacturing sector historically provided high-wage jobs for workers without advanced education. That pathway to the middle class essentially disappeared. Today's service sector jobs that replaced manufacturing don't pay the same. The average manufacturing wage is still significantly higher than the average service sector wage. Race and gender dynamics were complex. Research by Benjamin Lurch found that while industrial robots narrowed gender employment gaps, because men were more likely to work in manufacturing, they widened racial gaps. White workers who lost manufacturing jobs often transitioned to lower-paying service jobs. Non-white workers were more likely to drop out of the labor force entirely. Geographic immobility made the problem worse. In the past, workers who lost jobs in declining regions would move to growing regions. Between 1980 and 1990, a 1 percentage point change in manufacturing share led to a 4% change in local population as people relocated. But between 2000 and 2017, that same change only led to a 2.3% population shift. People were staying in economically depressed areas longer, often because they couldn't afford to leave. Underwater mortgages trapped families in place. Lack of savings made relocation impossible. The result? Concentrated pockets of persistent joblessness and economic despair. Then something changed. For decades, American policymakers largely accepted manufacturing decline as inevitable. The future, they said, belonged to services, technology, and the knowledge economy. Manufacturing was yesterday's economy. Then COVID-19 hit. Suddenly, America discovered it couldn't produce enough masks, or ventilators, or personal protective equipment. Critical pharmaceutical ingredients came from China. Advanced semiconductors came from Taiwan. Supply chains that had been optimized for cost revealed themselves as dangerously fragile. In March 2020, as hospitals ran short on N95 masks and ventilators, Americans learned a harsh lesson. You can't email yourself a ventilator. When the global just-in-time supply chain broke down, decades of offshoring became a life-or-death liability. Geopolitical tensions with China escalated. The possibility of a conflict over Taiwan, which produces over 90% of the world's most advanced computer chips, became impossible to ignore. Policymakers realized that economic dependence on potentially hostile powers was a national security vulnerability. The Biden administration responded with the most aggressive industrial policy in generations. In 2022, Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, authorizing $280 billion to boost domestic semiconductor production, including $52.7 billion in direct subsidies and tax credits. The Inflation Reduction Act allocated $369 billion for clean energy and domestic manufacturing, with massive subsidies for electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act committed $1.2 trillion to rebuilding American infrastructure. Together, these three bills represent nearly $500 billion in federal commitments, the largest peacetime industrial investment in American history. The impact has been dramatic. Manufacturing construction spending more than doubled in 2023 compared to 2022, reaching over $16 billion per month. Companies announced 364,000 reshoring and foreign direct investment jobs in 2022, a 53% increase from 2021 and a record high. Since 2010, nearly 1.6 million manufacturing jobs have been announced through reshoring and FDI. The private sector is responding aggressively. The Biden administration claims the legislation has catalyzed over $1 trillion in private investment, $449 billion in electronics and semiconductors, $184 billion in electric vehicles and batteries, $215 billion in clean power. For every dollar of federal spending, multiple dollars of private capital are following. Major companies are building massive new facilities. Intel is constructing semiconductor fabs in Ohio and Arizona with over $100 billion in planned investment. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is building a $65 billion facility in Arizona that will create 6,000 direct jobs. Micron is investing $20 billion in New York for memory chip production. Samsung, Qualcomm, and dozens of other semiconductor companies are making similar commitments. The electric vehicle battery sector is exploding. Companies like LG Energy Solution, SK Innovation, and Panasonic are building gigafactories across the American South. The electrical equipment and battery manufacturing sector alone accounted for 31% of reshoring job announcements in 2024. The geography of manufacturing is shifting. States like Arizona, Texas, and Ohio are seeing huge manufacturing investments. The Southeast is attracting automotive and aerospace plants. Even traditional Rust Belt states are seeing some revival. New York, which lost 330,000 manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2024, is now home to one of the largest semiconductor investments in American history. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This manufacturing renaissance won't bring back the jobs that were lost. Modern factories are fundamentally different from the factories of the 1970s. They're highly automated. They require workers with different skills, engineering degrees, technical training, computer literacy. A semiconductor fab is not a steel mill. The work is clean, precise, and highly technical. Consider the numbers. Intel's Ohio facility will cost $20 billion and employ 3,000 people. That's $6.7 million per job. The old manufacturing model created many more jobs per dollar invested. A 1970s auto plant might employ 5,000 workers with a fraction of the capital investment. The job density is a fraction of what it used to be. And the jobs that exist require different qualifications. The Department of Labor reports 601,000 open manufacturing jobs and 449,000 open construction jobs, but unemployment is near historic lows. The workers who lost manufacturing jobs 15 years ago aren't necessarily qualified for the jobs being created today. This creates a cruel irony. Communities devastated by manufacturing decline aren't necessarily the ones benefiting from manufacturing resurgence. The new semiconductor fabs are being built in Arizona and Texas, not in Youngstown or Flint. The displaced steel worker in Pennsylvania isn't getting hired at the new battery plant in Georgia. The United States lost 4.5 million manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2024. During that same period, real manufacturing GDP grew by 45%. That's the central paradox. We're producing more stuff with far fewer people. The reshoring wave is real and significant. But it's rebuilding a fundamentally different kind of manufacturing economy, one that produces more value but employs fewer people. The middle-class employment engine that manufacturing once represented won't be replicated simply by building new factories. So where does this leave us? Manufacturing employment in the United States today stands at about 12.9 million, roughly the same level as 2010, but still down from nearly 20 million in 1979. As a share of total employment, manufacturing has fallen from 22% in 1979 to just 8% today. Some economists argue this is fine. They point out that agricultural employment followed the same trajectory, falling from 40% of the workforce in 1900 to 2% today, but nobody thinks we should have more farmers. Productivity gains are good, they say. They make us richer. They free up workers for higher value activities. But that optimistic story ignores the massive human costs of the transition. It ignores the communities that were destroyed. It ignores the workers who never recovered. It ignores the political and social upheaval that decades of economic dislocation have produced. The uncomfortable reality is that America didn't manage the manufacturing decline. It happened to us. While other developed countries, particularly Germany, maintained robust manufacturing sectors through coordinated industrial policy, apprenticeship programs, and investment in worker training, America largely let market forces do their thing. The result was devastating for millions of people. Job retraining programs, the supposed solution to technological unemployment, have had mixed results at best. It's hard to retrain a 50-year-old steel worker to become a computer programmer. It's hard to convince someone to uproot their family and move across the country for an uncertain job. It's hard to replace a $25 an hour manufacturing job with benefits with a $13 an hour service job without benefits. But the story of American manufacturing isn't over. It's just entering a new chapter. The reshoring wave driven by the CHIPS Act and IRA represents a significant shift. After decades of offshoring, manufacturing is returning, though in a very different form. These new factories will be smaller, more automated, and more technologically sophisticated. The question is, who will benefit? If we're not careful, we could end up with a two-tier manufacturing sector. A small number of highly educated engineers and technicians earning excellent wages and gleaming new facilities, and a much larger number of workers left behind, working in increasingly automated warehouses and logistics centers for wages that don't build middle-class lives. Some regions will thrive. Others will continue to decline. Pittsburgh has successfully reinvented itself as a technology hub, transitioning from steel to healthcare, education, and robotics. But for every Pittsburgh, there's a Youngstown or a Flint that hasn't recovered and likely never will. The political implications are profound. The manufacturing decline fundamentally reshaped the electoral map. States that were once reliably Democratic because of strong labor unions, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, became swing states or turned red. The economic insecurity and cultural dislocation produced by deindustrialization created fertile ground for populism. Understanding the manufacturing decline is essential to understanding modern American politics, economics, and society. It explains the opioid epidemic. It explains political polarization. It explains why so many Americans feel the economic system is rigged against them. Because for millions of people, it was. Let's be honest about what happened. Over the course of 40 years, America dismantled the economic foundation of its middle class. We took an economy where a high school graduate could earn a solid wage, buy a house, raise a family, and retire with dignity, and we replaced it with an economy where those opportunities are vanishingly rare. Was it inevitable? Partially. Global economic integration and technological change are powerful forces. But choices mattered. Policy mattered. We chose to prioritize cheap consumer goods over good jobs. We chose to let communities collapse rather than invest in transitions. We chose to believe that markets would sort it out and that displaced workers would simply adapt. They didn't. They couldn't. And we're all living with the consequences. The 5 million lost manufacturing jobs represent more than numbers on a spreadsheet. They represent millions of disrupted lives, shattered communities, and broken promises. They represent a generation of Americans who played by the rules and got crushed anyway. The new industrial policy, the CHIPS Act, the IRA reshoring initiatives, represents an acknowledgement that the old approach failed. That markets alone won't preserve manufacturing capacity. That national security requires domestic production capability. That we can't just let critical industries evaporate and hope for the best. But whether this new approach will actually help the communities and workers devastated by the last 4 decades of decline remains an open question. Modern manufacturing creates fewer jobs per dollar invested. The workers it does employ need different skills than the workers who were displaced. The factories being built today are in different places than the factories that closed 20 years ago. We're not going back to 1979. We can't. The world has changed. Technology has changed. But we can learn from what happened. We can acknowledge the real costs of economic disruption instead of pretending creative destruction only destroys things that deserve to be destroyed. We can invest in workers and communities instead of assuming they'll figure it out on their own. We can recognize that GDP growth and stock market gains don't mean much if huge swaths of the population are getting left behind. The loss of 5 million manufacturing jobs isn't just an economic statistic. It's a warning. A warning about the costs of prioritizing efficiency over stability. About the dangers of assuming that what's good for global supply chains is automatically good for American workers. About the political consequences of abandoning entire regions to economic decline. America is the richest country in the world. But that wealth is increasingly concentrated among a shrinking few. The hollowing out of manufacturing was part of how we got here. Not the only part, but a big one. The question now is whether we can build a manufacturing sector that serves more than just corporate profits and GDP figures. Whether we can create good jobs in places that have been left behind for decades. Whether we can prove that industrial policy can be something more than subsidies to big corporations. The factories are being built. The investments are flowing. The question that remains is, who will this new manufacturing economy serve? If history is any guide, we shouldn't assume it will automatically benefit the people who need it most. That will require deliberate policy choices, sustained investment, and a recognition that economic transitions have real human costs that can't be ignored. The loss of 5 million manufacturing jobs taught us that lesson, painfully, expensively, and too late for millions of Americans. Let's hope we've learned it.